Amazing standing ovation. Thank you very, very much, Leanne, for your eloquent and brilliant spoken word once again. We'd like to move on as quickly as we can. Our next talk is titled 100 Years Behind, 100 Years Ahead. And our speaker will be Miko Peled. He's an American Israeli author and activist, born in Jerusalem to a well-known Zionist family. Peled's maternal grandfather signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and his father was a general in the Six-Day War in 1967. He's most known for his book, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. Please give a warm welcome for Miko Peled.
Good? Everybody hear me okay? Everybody hear me okay? Yeah. All right. Well, that was a tough act to follow. That was fantastic. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And to be here at this conference with people that I've known and heard about and admired and have been at this far longer than I have, like Karmi and Abishai and Carl and so many wonderful people who work so hard and have been working so hard on this issue for many, many years. And it's particularly an honor to be here on this campus at UCL, where I understand several students stood up when an Israeli soldier came up to speak and are now being persecuted. Are they here? Can you see a show of hands? Who are the students? Not any of them here? Yes? Can you stand up? You know, people forget that today we all admire and adore Nelson Mandela as though he was a god, but when Nelson Mandela was in prison for 28 years, people treated him as a terrorist. And people forget. And I think standing up against Israeli soldiers coming to speak on campuses is the right thing to do. And there were cases in the U.S. as well where students were not only thrown out of school but prosecuted as well. So this kind of persecution of the rights of Palestinians and this kind of hypocrisy that gives or that creates the illusion of symmetry between Israeli crimes and Palestinian fight for justice is exactly what we need to be fighting. And I believe that the struggle that goes on campuses here in the United States and other countries is leading the way to free Palestine. And the work that's being done on campuses and the price that students are paying, it's far greater than any of us that are out there speaking have to pay. But you are, I should say, all of you that are active, that organize events like this, that speak out, you are changing the conversation on Palestine. And when Palestine is free, as I believe it will be, and sooner than most people think, you will be able to proudly say you had a hand in making it happen. So good for you, congratulations. And I believe we all need to support these guys, because I understand they're facing some hearings and it might affect their future and their careers. So good job to all of you. So it's been 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, and I want to share with you this picture. It has everything to do with Balfour. This is at Tel Aviv Airport. We just flew here from Palestine. And this is a new poster that has just been placed at Ben Gurion Airport, talking about Zionism is an infinite ideal. And of course it goes on to say what wonderful things Zionism has done for Jews and for people around the world. Of course we all know that it's not true, we all know it's a lie, we know that Zionism is a terrible crime. But just to see how they celebrate it, how Israelis view this, how they view Zionism still as this wonderful thing, is really, really quite telling. And as we've heard earlier today, all the crimes and all the terrible things that did happen in Palestine and to Palestinians as a result of Zionism, to see them celebrate Zionism, and particularly at the airport where people come and go, I thought that was really, really quite telling, quite horrible to see. And this is the man, and this is his declaration. And I think one of the measures, one of the ways that we can measure just how powerful this declaration was, in terms of how Israelis see it, is that almost every Israeli city has a Balfour Street or a Balfour Plaza. Balfour is commemorated in almost every aspect of Israeli life. You learn about him, you see him, like I said, in the Balfour Street everywhere you go, and so on and so forth. But of course, today we know that this monster that was created is really the problem. And when we talk about when we talk about the crimes, when we talk about the issue of Palestine, the crime is Israel. The problem is the existence of Israel. And I think it's very difficult. It would be very difficult to be honest and not say that. What ails Palestine is the existence of Israel. That is exactly the problem. And of course, it didn't start with Balfour. The declaration, of course, was the result of many, many years of Zionist lobbies here, the Zionist lobby here in Palestine. A lobby to which my maternal grandfather was, of which he was a part. And he and several others, they were very distinguished. They were doctors and professors and so on. And they spoke many languages, and they knew how to drink tea like civilized people. And of course, they were white, and they didn't look Jewish at all. And so the powers that be liked them, and they could really relate to them. And they thought, well, this idea of having a white Jewish colony in Palestine, why not? And as was said earlier, it was really basically the Balfour Declaration, this promise to Lord Rothschild, was one white European racist offering another white European racist a country that belongs to somebody else. Neither one of them had anything to do, as you know, with Palestine. Now, I'm sure you all know who Hassan Kanafani was, and I hope that most of you, if not all of you, have read his work. But there is an interview with him in English that just popped up a few months ago on the internet. It's a short interview, 1970 in Beirut, and he's being interviewed by an Australian journalist. And this journalist is, speaking to him, and he says, he asks him about this conflict. And he said, it's not a conflict. And he said, well, the Civil War. And he was talking particularly about the fight of the Palestinian struggle in Jordan at the time, 1970. And he said, it's not a civil war. And then the journalist said, well, whatever it is. And Hassan Kanafani said, no, it's not a whatever. It's not a whatever. It is a struggle, the just struggle of an oppressed people for their rights. And there is a tendency, and the reason I bring it up is, Hassan Kanafani is very impressive in general, but this interview clarifies how important it is for us, those of us who are active on the issue of Palestine, to demand accuracy. To demand accuracy and not fall into this web of vagueness that the other side is trying to create. Palestine is not a dispute. There are no disputed territories. It's not an occupation. There are no occupied territories. It is not any of these, it is not a conflict. And I think it's important that we clarify. The country is not Israel-Palestine. The country is Palestine. Israel is the problem. But if we who speak for Palestine don't demand this accuracy, it's never going to take place. There's never going to be a change. It's not a dispute. It's a settler colonial project. It is brutal. It is violent. Does the state of Israel have a right to exist? No. Categorically, no. I mean, it's impossible for us to move ahead without being clear. Because the vagueness is exactly the tool that allows the other side to continue its crimes and get away with it. Because everybody's afraid to be too accurate, so everybody enjoys this vagueness and uses this vagueness. I was interviewed twice yesterday, and twice I was asked the same question, which is actually quite rare, about comparisons between what Israel does and Nazi Germany. And I understand that the father of the House of Commons made that comparison. I said he passed away recently, and I used the word genocide, and it's offensive. And the problem for me with that is that what offends them is the word. What offends them is the comparison. What should offend everyone are the actions that elicit the comparison. That Israel commits massacre after massacre after massacre in the Gaza Strip, when Israeli stormtroopers dressed in black uniforms and automatic weapons charge at unarmed, peaceful protesters, when thousands of Palestinians are in Israeli jails, these comparisons are inevitable. But the problem is not a comparison. The problem is not if we call it a genocide or we call it something else. The problem is what takes place on the ground. The problem is the fact that Israel is committing these acts. That is the problem, and that is what should be offensive to people. If they're not offended by the actions, then I don't care what, they're offended by the word. And if we talk about being offensive, if we talk about the word, let's take a look. Let's take a look at the United Nations definition of the crime of genocide. And then we can compare it to Israeli policies in Palestine over the last 7 decades, and you tell me if this is not almost, not identical 100%, but almost. And this is this was adopted by the UN General Assembly in December of 1948. And genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And anybody here wants to tell me that the actions of Israel, the destruction, the killing, and the massacres were not intended to destroy the Palestinian people, then that'll be a very interesting conversation. But killing members of the group, causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Well, if we're not talking about the shooting and the bombing and the massacres, then there's the depriving people of water, which of course, if you're not going to shoot someone, the only other sure way to make them die, to kill them, is deprive them of water. We know that. And then there are a couple of things that are not there. And then I think what is relevant to the issue of the Balfour Declaration is the following, Article 3, which talks about acts that shall be punishable. Genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, but where the Balfour Declaration comes in, and British policies in Palestine, and American policies in Palestine, and German policies in Palestine are all complicit in genocide. They are all complicit in the crimes of Israel. And if you read this, and if you take a close look, and again, thanks to historians like Avi Shlaim and Ilan Papin, we know what Israel, it's all documented. And from then, all the way till today, compare this list to Israeli policies of the last 7 decades, and you tell me if it does not read almost identical. And if calling what Israel does genocide is wrong. Now, if it offends someone, that is exactly the right sentiment, because those actions should offend people. We should all be offended. We should all be offended, and certainly the people who support the state of Israel ought to be offended by this. Now, one of the wonderful things that Avi Shlaim did in his presentation was bring things into context. And one of the tools, again, of the vagueness of the way the issue in Palestine is described is that there's never any context. Why are there so many people in Gaza? I know Israelis who ask the question, why is it so crowded and dirty? Why are they all living there? And these people are living on lands that were taken from the Palestinians who ended up in Gaza. And they don't know why it's so, there's never any context. Why are Palestinians shooting rockets at us? What's their problem? These are the questions, these are actual questions that educated people ask in Israel. Well, let's put it in context, So, the Balfour Declaration. 2 racists discussing somebody else's country. But in those days, white people could take the countries of people who were not white and do as they will with it. Neither one of them had anything to do with Palestine. As we heard earlier today, very few Jews actually lived in Palestine in 1917. Then we move forward several decades and we have the partition plan. And it's amazing to think, or it's impossible, I think, to think that whoever drew this map was not high. Because as we look at this map, it makes no sense at all. It is a map that makes absolutely no sense. And I think what it really means is that nobody actually intended for this map to actually materialize, for these boundaries to actually materialize. But besides the fact that this map makes no sense, as borders, as 2 states, the larger portion of the land is given, is promised to the smaller population, to the smaller group. Israeli, the Jewish society, the Jewish community in Palestine was still less than 500,000 people, about 500,000 people in 1947. The Palestinian community was far larger than that. Now, who is the UN to come in again, to come in and take the land from Palestinians and give it to the Jews? And of course, the vast majority of the Jewish community that lived in Palestine at that time were people who came to colonize. These are my grandparents' generation. Most of them either just came off the boat or happened to be born there, like my parents. And this makes it even more absurd. And then we've got the emergence of these two narratives. The Jewish Zionist narrative that says that this was an act, the creation of the State of Israel was the creation of, was an act of revival and heroism, which of course this is the narrative upon which I was raised and many people in the West have adopted this. Certainly the Western countries, the governments have adopted this. And then we have the other narrative that talks about conquest and ethnic cleansing and violence and terrorism, which was inflicted upon the Palestinians. And again, thanks to Avi Shleim and Ilan Pappin and the courage and the dedication to expose the truth, we now know that the Palestinian narrative of conquest and ethnic cleansing and terrorism was true. Of course, like I said, Palestinians have known this for decades. We needed two Jewish historians with Israeli background to come and tell us that it's true for us to actually believe it. For most people in the West, it's unheard of to believe the Palestinians. But thankfully they did the work and they published these wonderful books, and today we have that on good authority that the Palestinian narrative is true, that the Palestinian claims about what took place in 1948 and before that were actually true. And so to sum it up, and again, trying to be as clear as possible what took place, about what transpired immediately after 1948. 1948, Israel occupied the vast majority of Palestine and turned it into Israel. Hundreds and hundreds of towns and villages and so forth were destroyed. Somewhere between 800,000 or to 1 million Palestinians were forced out of their land. We know that. We know now today also that close to 6 million Palestinians live in refugee camps as a result of this. Okay? Now, we often hear about the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. People refer to them as the occupied Palestinian territories, which is interesting because are there other Palestinian territories that are not occupied somewhere? What do you mean the occupied Palestinian territories? All of Palestine is occupied. All Palestinian territories are occupied. There is no difference between the West Bank and other parts. And the only reason Israel waited to take the West Bank until 1967 was because of internal Israeli politics. And the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, there are no natural boundaries to these areas. The Israelis took a pencil and said, this is what we want. And this is how it's going to be. And of course, they were the strongest power and they got what they wanted. So then, 20 years later, the opportunity arose and they took the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in a completion of the work of the conquest of the land of Israel. It's not that the West Bank and Gaza Strip were something, completely different. They're part of Palestine. They're part of the land of Israel. And in effect, what happened in 1967 after the war, or as a result of the war, is that Israel established or completed the establishment of a single state over all of Palestine with exclusive rights for Jewish people, and that's what the State of Israel is. Any assumption, any hope, any wish, any dream that the State of Israel will one day retreat from those territories, allow the Palestinians to establish a state in those territories, is absolute misunderstanding of what happened over the last 100 years. There is no scenario, there is no way in which that will happen. We can have peace, or we can have Israel. Those are the options. And peace between Israelis and Palestinians is probably possible, but not in the context of the State of Israel. And basically, and I'll add this, by taking the West Bank and finishing the job, and again, the generals of 1967, the commanders of 1967, among whom my father was a member, talked about the conquest of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as finishing the job. They're finishing the job that they didn't get to finish in 1948. So then it was obvious. And immediately bulldozers began destroying Palestinian towns, Palestinian cities, ancient Palestinian villages, some of whom were there for 1,000 years, destroyed. And immediately they began building for Jews only in the West Bank, which was not surprising because that's exactly what they were doing since 1948 in other parts of Palestine. And today, if you've been there, you know there is no West Bank. There's Judea and Samaria, and they're parts of the state of Israel. And the police force is called the police force of Judea and Samaria. And the military commander is the commander of Judea and Samaria. You know, for any and all the bureaucracy and so forth, the roads, everything. There's no difference between those parts of the land of the state of Israel and other parts of the state of Israel. So the expectation that one day there will be a state of Israel that will allow the Palestinians to establish a state somewhere within those boundaries is really quite absurd. Now, you know, Israel has magical capabilities. Absolute magical capabilities. It is capable of making 2 million people disappear. And then they reappear every so often, and then they disappear again. And for the last couple of years, Gaza's gone. It's been gone. Has anybody heard of Gaza? No? It's gone. It's not there. 2 million people, poof, disappeared. How do they do this? How do they get us to be so blind, so numb, that in the one country that's probably has the highest profile of any country in the world, 2 million people who live without water, who live without rights, who live without access to proper nutrition and medical care, never mind are exposed to massacre after massacre after massacre, disappear. We don't know anything about them. 95% of the water in Gaza is unfit for human consumption. A child with an ear infection has no access to antibiotics. A child with a curable cancer will die, whereas a Jewish child 5 minutes away in an Israeli town will live with the exact same cancer, because Israel prevents the Palestinian child from having access to proper medical care, never mind the bombing. I won't go through all the statistics, you can read them yourself, but 2 million people live under these conditions. And the United Nations has come up and said that by 2020, the Gaza Strip will be uninhabitable. When was it inhabitable? Talk to people in Gaza who've been in Gaza, who lived in Gaza since 1948. Not 1948, but you know, the Gaza Strip was created in the early 50s. It has been a humanitarian disaster from the beginning. We need to wait till 2020 to declare it a humanitarian disaster? The hypocrisy sometimes reaches such heights that it's beyond belief. Beyond absolute belief. And what's interesting is people talk about the last 6, 8, 10 years of Israeli attacks. But Israeli attacks on Gaza began as soon as Israel created the Gaza Strip as a place to herd the refugees from the southern part of Palestine mostly. They began, in fact, they had a unit that was established specifically to go into Gaza and commit massacres, and was commanded by none other than the great butcher Ariel Sharon as a young officer, Unit 101. And in the beginning they were attacked, they would go in there and commit terrible acts of murder and massacre to punish those Arabs because they were infiltrators. There was a problem of infiltration, because as we heard, Israel passed a law that made it illegal for the Palestinians to return. Then they didn't call them infiltrators anymore, they started calling them fedayeen, which are fighters. Then they called them terrorists, they decided to move to a different language. Today they call them Hamas. The name of this devil that it resides in Gaza is evolving. Another thing that keeps evolving is the technology. But none of this would have happened. Or I should say, all of this is the result of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. There would be no Gaza Strip, there would be no Fedayeen, there would be no Hamas, there would be no problem if it wasn't for the ethnic cleansing of 1948. That is why there's a problem. That is why the other side always tries to prevent us from seeing context. There is never context. And this is Ariel Sharon on the end there with his unit coming out from these massacres and committing these massacres of Gaza. They're treated as heroes. There are posters of them coming out like heroes that defended us against these Jew-hating Arabs, bloodthirsty Arabs. There's never been an army, there's never been a tank, there's never been certainly an F-16 warplane in Gaza. Today, of course, the technology looks like this. So whereas when Ariel Sharon was a young officer, they were killing hundreds, perhaps dozens. In 2014, they killed 2,500 people in 51 days, and those were the ones that died immediately. We're not talking about the babies who were born as a result of the bombing prematurely. We're not talking about tens of thousands of injured people who probably died and will die because there's no access to medical care. And then they talk about the tunnels. The tunnels, the terror tunnels. The fact that 2 million people need tunnels in order to survive, that's the problem, not the fact that they built tunnels. You know, that's the absurdity. I tried to get into Gaza several times and I couldn't. I can't go through Israel because as an Israeli citizen, Israeli law prohibits it. I couldn't go through Egypt several times because the Egyptians are, well, the Egyptian government prohibits it. So at one point, friends of mine wrote to me from Gaza and said, would I consider coming in through a subway? And then I said, sure, and this is the subway, this is the tunnel that I actually took a couple of years ago to get into Gaza. But even this is gone. Even this is gone. You know? But the problem is that the Palestinians are building tunnels. Of course they're going to build tunnels. You lock 2 million people in, they're going to build tunnels to try to get out. That's not the problem. The problem is that they need the tunnels. And of course, this is the destruction. This is Gaza. A couple of those pictures I took myself. And then we have the rest of Palestine. We have areas, entire areas of Palestine forgotten. Jerusalem, for example. Home demolitions. Beautiful communities that are part of Jerusalem, gone. Home demolition after home demolition after home demolition. We're not only talking about residents of the West Bank, we're talking about residents of Jerusalem, we're talking about Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. Every Israeli I know has built a part of their home without a permit. Nobody even imagines that the army will come in one day and destroy their home. Everybody's got a balcony or a second story or something, because getting a permit is difficult, and it's expensive. Israeli Jews build without permits all the time. They would never imagine that the army would come and do this to their home. This happens in Colonialism, which is a town with Israeli citizens. This is right outside of Jerusalem. Entire areas of Jerusalem that have become ghost towns. Nothing but destruction and death. Oh, the only thing you can think of, and here I'm picking up this beautiful marble. You know, people just built this home. Spent huge amounts of money. Gone. Destruction. The only word that I could think of, entire communities, Beit Nabala, this is Beit Nabala, between Jerusalem and Ramallah. Look at this. Beautiful buildings, businesses. Because of the wall, because of the apartheid roads, dead, gone. The only word that could come and appropriately describe this was Holocaust. Complete Holocaust. It is horrifying to see. It is absolutely horrifying to see. And because we don't see it, you don't see it when you're driving the main roads. You don't see it if you're in Jerusalem or the West Bank or anywhere else. Nobody knows this even exists. Destruction and death and desolation. That's all. This is the gift of Zionism, by the way. This is the gift of the Balfour Declaration. You know, look at this. Beautiful buildings, and of course the wall destroyed entire towns. So they're desolate, ghost towns. Hebron, Shuhada Street, closed. Closed for business. Why? Because. And by the way, if you look at the order that closed Shuhada Street in Hebron, it says specifically that it is not permitted to anyone to drive through it unless they have a vehicle that is registered in Israel. Well, who has a vehicle that's registered in Israel? The settlers that live there. The settlers that caused this. The settlers that caused the massacre of the Ibrahimi Mosque. They can drive up and down no problem. But not Palestine. This is Palestine, and it's forgotten. Completely forgotten. And the one question, again, that is never asked is why? Why is Israel attacking Gaza so many times? There has never been, there never could be, any kind of threat to Israel from Gaza. Or from those other communities that were desolated. Or from Shuhada Street. There is no military threat. So why is it that for 7 decades Israel is committing these horrible massacres in Gaza? Bombing after bombing after bombing. Why? There is no military threat. There has never been a military threat. It's a myth. Somehow it's again one of these magic tricks that Israel manages to convince the world that it's acting in self-defense. And all the governments and all the talking heads and the radio shows and the TV, everybody's shaking their head. Yes, it's self-defense. It's self-defense. Against what? Against what? A few machine guns and rocks? What? It's complete nonsense. But why is it that Israel continues to do this? Why is it for 7 decades? And I believe the reason is not that there's a military threat, because there certainly isn't, but there is a threat to the legitimacy of the state of Israel, and that cannot be tolerated. Israel, the legitimacy is everything. It's the Holy Grail. Israel will do everything it possibly can in order to prevent questioning its legitimacy, because it has no legitimacy. Because when we look at these humanitarian disasters that Israel has created, when we look at the genocidal ethnic cleansing in which Israel has been involved for 7 decades, that raises serious questions as to the legitimacy of the state of Israel. Now with Gaza, they can't just do nothing. People are going to ask questions. It gets embarrassing. So there are only 2 options. The first option is to allow the refugees to return, to rebuild Gaza, to pay them the restitution they deserve. But we don't want that, because we don't want the Arabs back. We just got rid of them. So the only other option is to kill them and blame them for being terrorists. And again, another magic trick. It works. The world claps. The world applauds Israel as they're bombing and massacring people in Gaza. It's another magic trick. You kill the victims and you blame them for being terrorists. And the whole world applauds you, and more money comes from America, and more weapons come from America, and more support from Britain and Germany and everybody else, and the EU. It's a wonderful trick. That is why Palestinians are paying the price, because their very existence, particularly in places like Gaza, raise questions as to the very legitimacy of the state of Israel and the very crime that the state of Israel represents. That is why they must die. Now there's one thing that we're never allowed to bring up when we talk about Palestinians, and that is resistance. Because resistance means there's legitimacy to their fight. We can call them terrorists, and we can call them victims. Those are the 2 spheres in which Palestinians are allowed to survive, to be recognized. But not resistance, because resistance means there's some kind of legitimacy. And there's a wonderful quote by Frantz Fanon, which you may have heard, where he talks about colonialism, and he says that colonialism is not a machine capable of thinking, a body endowed with reason. It is naked violence and only gives in when confronted with greater violence, which is why, by the way, a 2-state solution is impossible. Because colonialism cannot be restrained. It's a beast, incapable of thinking, has no reason, has insatiable appetite, which is, of course, I think, one of the reasons why it's going to fall. But this was the reality that, of course, Fanon was talking mostly about European colonialism in Africa. Thankfully, today we know, thanks to the experience in India, and thanks to the experience of Black America, and thanks to the experience in South Africa, and to a large degree thanks to the Palestinian resistance, we know today that armed resistance is not the only way to defeat colonialism. It is not the only way to defeat injustice. We know that economic pressure works, we know that political isolation works, and we know that boycott, divestment, and sanction work. And that's another thing, people get queasy about BDS. I was interviewed yesterday by this very sweet journalist, Palestinian, and I was wearing this button. And she said, I couldn't help noticing your button. I thought, you couldn't help noticing? Why do you think it's a pink button and it's got BDS this big on it? I want you to notice it. I want you to ask me the question. It's principled. It works. It has a track record. It's dedicated. It's non-violent. It scares the hell out of the other side. Israel is scared to death from BDS, which means it works. We know it works. And it comes as a call, like Abishai was saying earlier. This is a call from Palestinian civil society, the largest coalition of organizations and unions and individuals, calling on us, telling us how we can help, telling us how we can contribute to the freedom and to bring about freedom and justice in Palestine. It's a gift to us. BDS is a gift that was given to all of us by Palestinian civil society. And to be queasy about it, and then people say, yes, we can boycott this, or we're not going to boycott that, because that's not fair. We're only going to boycott settlements in the West Bank, we're not going to boycott settlements in Jerusalem or the Galilee. Why the hell not? Palestinians live in communities where they have no electricity, no water supply, no sanitation, no roads. And the excuse is that there's too remote. But as soon as there's an outpost there for Jews, the water has no problem getting there, the electricity has no problem getting there, the roads have no problem being built, and there's an army unit there to protect them, immediately, overnight. Israel must be boycotted. Israel must be kicked out of FIFA. Israel must be kicked out of the Olympics. Israel must be kicked out of universities. There's nothing to be queasy about. BDS works. It's the right thing. It's got a terrific track record. You can look at their website, you can see the campaigns that have worked. There's a very strong campaign now against HP, against Hewlett Packard. And some of us are old enough to remember there was a campaign against, a boycott campaign against Polaroid because during apartheid South Africa, Polaroid were making the IDs that black Africans had to carry in South Africa. So there's a boycott of Polaroid. HP is doing the same thing. They create these biometric ID cards that the Palestinians have to wear. And plus they supply a lot of the technology to the Israeli apartheid regime, to the armed forces. So it's what happened in South Africa, but on steroids. So everybody should support BDS at any level. I mean, whether you choose not to buy a product, or whether you start a campaign, or you participate in one of these campaigns. But the BDS movement and the BDS, and I know that Israel is afraid, because last year there was a major conference in Jerusalem, how to fight the BDS. And every journalist, and every politician, and Mossad, former Mossad operatives were all there. And they were talking about BDS as though there was a nuclear threat. That's exactly what they were talking about. So we know, and now there's a directive from the Minister of Internal Security calling on citizens to try to identify BDS activists from real tourists, and then notify the authorities if you find a real BDS activist. I wore this, we were just in Palestine. I wore this in the old city of Jerusalem, and a Palestinian came up to warn me that this was dangerous for me to wear. You know, that is just how scared they are of BDS. So there's going to be absolutely no question the BDS is a major part. It's probably not the only part, it's never one thing, but a major part of the resistance, the great work the the Popular Resistance Committees on the ground are doing, in the various villages and towns where they have protests. And like I said earlier, student activities on campuses. These are the heart, these are the main pillars of the Palestinian resistance today. Now we can talk about the problems all day, but I think those of us that sit here and in other rooms across the rich world, those of us that are rich, free, and alive all at the same time, we have a responsibility. We cannot say there is no hope. We cannot say it's going to take forever. We cannot say it's too complicated. We cannot say that Israel is too strong. We have to find hope, and we have to act on it. We have to. We do not have a choice. All people of conscience, unless they support the state of Israel, all people of conscience need to get up and find the hope and then act. And the question is really very simple, because there are only two options. We either accept the reality where Palestine is occupied and there's a state that offers exclusive rights to Jewish people, which is what Israel is, but that comes as a package deal. It comes with massacres, it comes with political prisoners, it comes with racist laws. That's the state of Israel. There is no other way. I think Omar Barghouti said, there is no way to have a Jewish state in Palestine without it contravening on the rights of Palestinians. There is no way, and that should always be opposed, and I agree. So that's one option, and there's only one other option, and that is a free Palestine, a democratic Palestine that respects human rights, equal rights, and so forth. And none of the problems that exist in Palestine, none of the injustices, not the siege on Gaza, not the right of return, not the political Palestinian prisoners, thousands of them, none of this will be resolved as long as the state of Israel exists. All of these things can be resolved only once we get to a point where we have a single democracy with equal rights. Then we can create the conditions to allow the refugees to return. Until then, it's just talk. The right of return is just talk. And like Radha Karmi was saying, there is no absolute way that this thing gets resolved without the right of return being implemented. And there's no way the right of return can be implemented unless There's a democracy with equal rights, and there's a legislature that represents Palestinians. Of course, Palestinians are a majority now, so they have a good chance of having a prime minister and so forth. That is a reality that is the one step that will allow all the other steps to take place. The siege on Gaza will not end, the massacres will not end, the political prisoners will not be freed, and the right of return will not be implemented as long as the state of Israel exists. There has to be a post-Zionist reality. There has to be a real democracy with equal rights. And as we've seen in South Africa, and we've seen in Latin America, and we've seen many examples just throughout my life, that is a real possibility. That is not some futuristic dream. That is not utopia. That is what we must demand, because that is the right thing to do. That is how we get justice for Palestine. And we can't get it by being meek, and we can't get it by being queasy about BDS. We can only get it by being absolutely clear and absolutely firm, and demanding what is to be done. Now I want to leave you with this image. We heard about refugee camps earlier today and the horrible conditions. We visited this picture is from a refugee camp, and I can promise you, if any of us we visited the refugee camp, within 5 minutes we were all in tears. It is impossible to walk through this camp. It is impossible to see the conditions and not break down. Forget living in them. And look at these kids. You'd think they were living in paradise. You'd think they were living in paradise. Look at it. And I think as we see this picture, we all need to imagine and to make very clear to ourselves, when we say free Palestine, what does that mean? When we say free Palestine, what do we mean? Are we talking about some utopian dream? Then just move on to something else. If we're not willing to fight for this, if we're not willing to act for this, if we're not willing to pay the price, we need to move out of the way. Because a free Palestine means a free Palestine, from the river to the sea, from Al-Jalil to the Negev Desert, including Jerusalem, and Jaffa, and Haifa, and every other place. It means the right of return. That's what a free Palestine means. Palestinians have suffered long enough, too long in fact, and have compromised, and have been shown willingness to compromise for too long. There's no more room for compromise. A free Palestine must mean all of Palestine free. Free from apartheid laws. If we do our job, and if we fulfill our responsibility, then a free Palestine can and will be a reality, and it will be a reality much sooner than most people think. Thank you very much.
We are short on time, but we would like to take advantage of his presence here and ask as many questions as we can. So we will be taking 3 questions at a time. So I'd like to ask, please do try keep them 30 seconds, and please try not to make statements while we ask questions.
Yeah, Miko, how you doing? There's one thing that I get very irritated about, and we see it with the UN, right? There was another resolution passed there, resolution 2334. It's all very well passing these resolutions, but when is the world going to act on this, you know, because this is coming to a stage now where, as you say, it's gone too far. Palestinian people have suffered, and these actions need to be put onto, the words need to be put on the actions of these resolutions.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was absolutely brilliant and inspiring. You've definitely given me a bit of sustenance, you know, because I think all of us who are struggling for Palestinian rights sometimes need somebody to also give us the strength, you know, to keep going. But my two questions, very briefly. The first is, I would like you to elaborate on the policy, Israel's policy towards Gaza. I'd like to understand, thank you for putting it in a historical perspective, which is really interesting, something I haven't actually heard before. But now that the settlements have been removed, do you think that Israel has any kind of game plan for Gaza? I mean, what kind of, what are they trying to do with it? That's the first question. The second question is, I just wondered if you could very briefly explain a little bit about your own personal journey, given your family history, to the position you now take. I haven't yet being the operative word, read your book, so if you could just share a little bit of that.
That's two.
Thank you. When Netanyahu went to America and met with Donald Trump, he made quite an interesting statement that revealed quite a lot about Israeli-state relations with its neighbours at the moment. He used to say that we're in a hostile neighbourhood, but now he quite openly congratulated the fact that a lot of the neighbours are seeking alliance with Israel at the moment. Now, they say that power can seek for through right demand, and obviously it's important for people like us to advocate on behalf of Palestine. But what can we do on the Muslim nations and the Arab nations that surround Israel to put more pressure on the state?
Okay. All right, thank you. Look, UN resolutions regarding Israel have no teeth. We know that. Which is why, and in a way, I mean, they're symbolic, but beyond that, you're absolutely right, they have no teeth. Which again, why BDS is so important, why grassroots action is important, which is why that is the way things are going to change. UN resolutions, policies of the British, government and the American government and so forth, they're going to be the last ones to jump on the wagon. They're going to be the last ones to say, oh yes, of course, we always support the Palestinian rights. Just like they always loved Nelson Mandela, even when he was, slave labor on Robben Island. You're right. There are no teeth. There's no way to. The only UN resolution that Israel respects is the partition resolution. It goes back to show that somehow it gives Israel legitimacy. But it goes bottom up. And these kinds of resolutions or these kinds of things will only change and be relevant once they have no other choice. So that's the answer to that. Israel policy regarding Gaza and the game plan. The game plan is a really good question, and this is something that's almost impossible to understand because this is the game plan. This is it. There is no solution beyond this. This is it. Israel established a Jewish state over all of Palestine. Now, they managed to, even though it's a small country, they managed to create such effective segregation and lock up the Palestinians in such a way that Israelis don't even know the Palestinians exist. You can visit Israel and not even know that there's a Palestinian, not know anything about them, not see them, not hear them, they're not on the news, they're not discussed in the Knesset. There's nothing, they don't exist, they're air, they're nothing. And when I said that Israel has this talent to magic, it's true, they're gone. This is the game plan. We are getting richer, we are doing better, our economy is fine, we have some problems, a little crime, a little violence, what are you going to do? These soldiers come back and, their domestic abuse is up, youth violence is up, but that's kind of the way it is. We have no choice but to live in this reality. This reality is our destiny. As long as we're strong, we can kill more of them than they kill of us, we're fine. And this is the game. This is the end game. There's nothing beyond this. And this, by the way, is not new. This was, this thinking was established in the early 1950s. This is the reality, and we have no choice, which is why Israel had to, why Israel initiated so many wars, because they always have to maintain this sense that we are the toughest bully in the neighborhood, nobody can mess with us. And that's how it is. From time to time, we're going to have a little war, what are you going to do? This is the end game. This is Israel. It's a very sad thing to say. And my personal journey is someone who grew up in this very safe, very clean, very, this sphere of advantage. I assumed everybody lived like this. with nice roads, with clean running water 24 hours a day, with plenty of food. You couldn't imagine not having clean water in the faucet, or I had no idea, no concept that there were people living, even as Israeli citizens, in Palestinian towns, Israeli citizens, that had no bathroom, that had a toilet outside, or had no access to running water. I had no idea, or electricity, So the sphere of the privilege, suddenly to take the journey, the subtitle of the book is Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. It's a very short journey, because you're never more than 10 minutes away from a Palestinian community, but they're dry, and they're dusty, and they're not clean, and they're weird, and, they seem like they're different. Something must be wrong with them. I had no idea that while people like myself who have all the water in the world, they get 10 hours of water per week. Running water per week, if they get running water at all. And they were talking about Israeli citizens. We're not even talking about Gaza or the West Bank. So that was the journey that I took, and it was a very scary journey because it's a journey into the sphere where you're always told that it's dangerous because they're terrorists and they hate us and they want to kill Jews and they've always killed Jews, because the Zionist narrative includes this big lie about the Arab Jews, which again, obviously I clarified here, but there was no anti-Semitism. We knew that they killed Jews all the time, and that's why the Jews had to flee from all the Arab countries, and thankfully we saved them by taking them in. That's the narrative. So these are Arabs, and I had to overcome that, and I overcome the fact that it's a felony to go into Palestinian territories, and it's life-threatening, and see Palestinians on the other side and realize that it was all a lie. So that's kind of my personal journey. I had a bit of an advantage because my father, after he retired from the military, dedicated the rest of his life to this idea that we know now as the two-state solution. So the two-state solution, as we know today, was born in the late 60s, early 70s, with my dad and several other very prominent Zionists who believed that we have a right to the land, it's all the land of Israel, but we have to compromise some because there is another nation living here. And if we want to maintain ourselves as a Jewish democracy, we have to compromise a little bit. So we'll give them a little state in boundaries that we determine, under conditions that we determine, and then we're going to be fine. What they didn't understand is that you cannot restrain the beast. This beast that is called settler colonialism has an insatiable appetite, and it's unrestrainable. They thought they could restrain it, and of course, they realized we know today that they were wrong. So that's kind of my journey in a nutshell. Another issue that, the third question about the Arab nations is an important one. It comes up a lot. As we all know, the Arab countries do not have democracies. They're governed by corrupt leaders. The reason they are governed by corrupt leaders is because Israel and the U.S. supply those leaders with money and weapons. So, and every time there is a democratically elected leader, like they had in Egypt, and the Americans and the Israelis don't like him, they get rid of him. And they place him as a dictator. So disagreeing with Israel, disagreeing with America is bad for business if you're an Arab president or general or whatever it is that you are, There used to be a list, I remember growing up, there was a list of countries that were called the Refusal Front. The Refusal Front were the bad Arabs. These were Arabs that won't recognize Israel, that support the Palestinian cause. That's where the Palestinian training camps would be, the Fedayeen training camps would be. And I'll give you a list of the names of those countries, and tell me if there's something that, if there's something similar, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya. Gone. It's bad for business. On the other hand, you have Jordan, you've got Egypt, they do business with Israel, they have peace with Israel, they get, and the Gulf states and so forth. So in a way, if you're gonna support the Palestinian cause, you're gonna have to pay a price. And since these are dictatorships that are being supported with a lot of money and a lot of weapons, it's tough to fight. If these were, regular democracies, none of them would, all of them would be supporting the Palestinian cause because that's the sentiment. But the reality that exists today, this is why. So we can't blame, people think say the Arabs. How come the Arabs aren't doing anything? Well, the Arabs that can do, but there are certain restraints that are being placed upon them so that they won't do. Sisi now is far worse in terms of Gaza than any other Egyptian president ever was. Do you have another round?
Stop there.
So I don't need my. It's two quick questions really. What kind of conversations do you have with your family and people you grew up with, given that you kind of maybe changed your views? And secondly, if Mark Reged was here, how do you think a conversation would go with him?
Not much. It'd be a very short conversation.
I have two brief questions. One is, would Israel survive without military and economic support from the United States? That's one. The second question is, there are 5.5 million Jewish voters in the United States. I'm Irish, and we Irish in America, we outnumber the Jewish voters perhaps by about 10 to 1. And if we take the blacks and the Hispanics and the Asian people, and even the Jewish people themselves, because I have seen campaigns by the Jewish people in New York and different cities campaigning against Israel. So I think that there should be more concentration on voters in the United States, because this is the real kernel of the whole problem. Because without the support of the United States, I believe that the same has happened in my own country. We have a peace process in Ireland, and I believe that Israel will be forced to have a peace process similar to what we have in Ireland. Finally, I just want to say about Boycott. Boycott was an English landlord who came to Ireland and took our lands, and then as a settler, and then Irish Republicans decided not to pay him rent, not to serve him in the shops, not to serve him in the pubs, not to deliver the letters to him, and that succeeded, and he left. So we gave the word boycott to the British language, and I hope that the boycott that you have advocated to do will also be
There's a reason why everybody loves the Irish.
Thank you. Miko, as as a pro-justice or a pro-Palestinian, how are you being treated whenever you cross from the occupied territories to the outside world, I mean, through the Israelis? And why do you think Israel is not accepting one-state solution, despite the fact two-state solution is dead long time ago?
Why Israel is not accepting it?
Yeah. Would it ever accept it?
Okay. Well, my conversations with my family are interesting. My direct family, we're not that far apart. I mean, I've taken a step beyond what I think is comfortable for most of my family members. But they know what I do, and this is just the way it is. And so within the family, we try to maintain some kind of, family relations. Sometimes more tense than others, but it's kind of the reality. A more interesting conversation with my mother, who's 90. And she has very clearly supports this idea of a single market with equal rights on the one hand. On the other hand, and I mentioned this in the epilogue to the second edition, there's a picture in what used to be my father's study that she kept after my father passed away of David Ben-Gurion, who of course is the father of the Jewish state, and of course was a brutal murderer and a criminal that we know today. But it's initialed by him. He gave it to my father when my father became a general. And I said to her, so as we talk about these things, she goes, on the one hand, from this very, this sense that, justice should prevail and Palestinians should have equal rights and so forth, to the sense that, oh my God, no, we can't take this off. This is Ben-Gurion. Are you kidding? He's our hero. So she kind of goes back and forth between her emotions and her more rational thinking, perhaps. But that's the reality. I don't think a conversation between me and any Zionist representative or representative of the Zionist state will ever take place. They will never show up. They will absolutely never show up. And I'm not really quite sure I'm willing to give them the the respect of sitting in a room with them. I don't think they deserve. I don't think they deserve a seat at the table. You know, they're always looking for this equality, for the symmetry. I don't think they deserve a seat at the table. I have this conversation with people in America all the time. You know, all these groups that try to, you know, be welcoming and dialogue. I'm wondering, why do you want to dialogue with them? Would you dialogue with the KKK? They're the KKK. The Zionists are the KKK without the case. They're not even embarrassed by what they do. They don't even hide their faces. Although now Israeli soldiers, by the way, show up to protest with ski masks because they don't want to be filmed. But would you sit down with them? Would you sit down with Nazis? Would you sit down with all these fascists? I don't think they deserve a seat at the table. In America, they're always afraid, and all these, they have the interfaith groups and dialogue groups, and they're afraid that the Jews would leave. And my thing is, let these Jews leave and let other Jews come in. There are plenty of Jews around that can come, you know, to the table if you want to talk. Why do you want to talk with these Jews? You know, so I don't think they deserve a seat at the table. I don't think an ambassador of the state of Israel deserves to be, you know, deserves a debate. So would Israel survive without U.S. support? I think Israel would survive. I mean, the $3-4 billion that Israel gets is a drop in the bucket when you look at the GDP, Israel's GDP, and Israel's, and you know, the Israeli government's annual budget, and particularly the defense budget. You know, it's a drop in the bucket. It's an important drop, but it's still a drop. So I think Israel, I think even if the U.S. stopped giving Israel all this money, Israel wouldn't stop. Besides the fact that the actions of the state of Israel and its policies are based on their ideologues. They're extremist, zealous ideologues. You know, they believe in this stuff. They believe that these crimes are the right thing to do. They believe that what they're doing is the right thing to do, even though they know they do terrible things. So it would make some difference. Certainly, if it would be helpful if America supported the boycott. That would be a difference. If America supported kicking Israel out of FIFA and out of the Olympic Games and so forth, that would make a difference. But it's a package deal. It's not going to do one without the other. In terms of the vote, you know, it's the reason Israel has such support in the U.S. and I suspect in the U.K. as well is not because of the Jewish vote. It's because of the Israeli lobby. I know members of Congress who lost their seats for speaking out against Israel, and they have no Jews in their districts. They have no Jews in their districts. They have no Jews in their districts that they have to support Israel. Because what AIPAC does, AIPAC has a real good understanding of the American election system. And they know how to support a candidate, and they know how to not support a candidate, and know how to create dissent. They know how to make a candidate lose, and they know how to make a candidate win. Because they're a very effective lobby, and as we know, especially from today, that Israeli lobby has been in existence before the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was already one of the successes of the Zionist lobby. So can you imagine today, 100 years later, how much more effective they are? And they're very good at that. So it's not just a matter of the Jewish vote, it's a matter of the lobby knowing how to manipulate, and really how to, it's more than just manipulate. I mean, they use mafia-like tactics and blackmail in order to get the job done. And any member, listen to this, we're not just talking about members of Congress and senators. We're talking about members of city council members. Anybody gets elected to a city council gets an invitation to a free visit to Israel to see how wonderful it is. City councils, small city councils. So they spend a lot of money on this. So the vote is only one part of that. It's something much more sophisticated, sadly, that they've been, and they've been very good at it. I mean, when you look at American school books, like a high school book, and you read what they learn about the ancient world, they learn about the ancient Hebrews, and all of the material is from the Bible. All of it. Because there's no proof that there was a King David. There's no historical archaeological proof that there was a Moses. If they learn all these things in history, in other words, it's all taken from the Bible, and in America they have this debate on whether they should teach creationism or evolution. I'm thinking, might as well teach creationism. You're teaching all of this from the Bible anyway. You know? So that's just how effective the narrative is. That's how effective the Israeli lobby is in the United States. Now, Israel has its own vision of a one state. Israel, when you look at Naftali Bennett and Avigdor Lieberman, who are ministers or members of the Israeli cabinet, and even Netanyahu, they absolutely believe in a single state that exists in Palestine right now, in an apartheid state. there's one good thing that happened as a result of this idiot being elected president of the United States. It is that he has emboldened those people within the Israeli political world that talk about a single state. So now suddenly we're in a place where, okay, two-state solution is out of the question. It's always been out of the question, but now we're not even talking about it. So now this forces the conversation, are you talking about apartheid or democracy? Which is really the only conversation that we should be having. Because if you support Israel, you're supporting apartheid. If you're supporting democracy, you're supporting an entirely different story. And in a way, that forces the conversation. But the Israeli vision of a single state is what exists today. It's an apartheid regime with no rights for Palestinians and all the rights for Jews, which is already there. But since there's talking about dropping the conversation altogether, which is the right thing to do, then now we have to say, fine, so you mean democracy. You mean we could have a Palestinian prime minister. And Ahmed Tibi, who was a member of the Israeli Knesset, who's a Palestinian member of Knesset, said, fine, if that's what we're talking about, I could be the next prime minister. You know? And of course, Israelis are shaking their boots that might happen. Of course, we can't allow the Palestinians, we can't give them voting rights. So the Israeli vision of a single state is very different than the vision that I was presenting today.
Unfortunately, that will
We're
have
good
to
to
be
go.
it.
All right, thank you all
Thank
very
you
much.
very, very much. We'll now be having a very, very quick 5 to 10 minute break where there will be prayer for anyone, and there will also, if anyone would like to buy now for